The cold, sterile corridors of the spaceship felt claustrophobic, each step echoing louder than the last. Captain Leo Radek, a seasoned mercenary hardened by years of conflict, paced through the ship, deep in thought. His eyes narrowed as he sifted through the transaction that had led him to this moment, a debt owed to a notorious crime syndicate. The exchange had been simple: one alien slave, handed over as payment for a contract. A simple transaction for someone like Leo, who had seen enough of the galaxy's dark underbelly to know that life, in its harshest form, was often bought and sold with little regard for the cost. Leo wasn't a man to question his employers. He knew the rules of survival, and they were simple: pay your debts, and never ask about the goods you're handed. But as he stared at the small, huddled figure in front of him, something stirred inside him, something unfamiliar. The alien woman, bound by chains, her head bowed low, was like any other slave he had seen in the countless transactions of his career. But there was something in the way she held herself, something defiant in her posture despite the chains that bound her. Her skin was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light of the cargo hold, and her eyes, striking violet, wide and filled with a quiet sadness, spoke of a life that was far from ordinary. They weren't the eyes of someone broken, or of someone who had surrendered to fate. They were the eyes of someone who had been forced into submission, yet not without resistance. And in those eyes, Leo saw something he hadn't anticipated, something that made him pause. The crew had already moved on, uninterested in the woman, focusing instead on the logistical details of the transaction. But Leo couldn't shake the image of her. He had no interest in pity or compassion. He was a soldier, a mercenary, and his life was defined by duty, not emotion. Yet, there she was, this alien woman with the mysterious aura, standing in the same room as him, her fate already sealed by the hands of men far more ruthless than Leo could ever be. "Name?" Leo asked, his voice rough from years of battle and command. He didn't expect an answer, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. She lifted her head slightly, meeting his gaze, her voice soft but steady. "Zara." The name echoed in Leo's mind. It wasn't just a name, it was a whisper of something lost, a story hidden behind the dark walls of the universe. Leo couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt a pang of something like curiosity, or maybe even guilt. He was supposed to be doing a job, not contemplating the lives of those he dealt with. But Zara was different, and she made him question the life he had built for himself in the coldness of space. The ship was silent, save for the hum of the engines, as Leo led her to her quarters. It was a modest room, nothing more than a small cage of metal and glass, designed for those like her who were meant to be nothing but a possession. Zara's movements were slow, deliberate. She didn't look at him, didn't try to make eye contact. She seemed resigned, but there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of strength. It was a quiet strength, one that hadn't yet been extinguished. Leo had seen many captives in his time, but none had ever carried themselves like her. It was as if she was waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. Leo locked the door behind him and turned to leave, but before he could exit, Zara's voice stopped him. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, her tone calm but carrying an air of defiance. He glanced back at her, half amused. "I believe in survival," he replied, his words coming out sharper than he had intended. She didn't flinch. Instead, she simply nodded as if she had already expected that answer. Leo wasn't sure what compelled him to speak, but he found himself asking, "What's your story, Zara?" For a moment, there was a silence that stretched between them, one filled with unsaid words and unasked questions. Zara lowered her gaze once again, as if the weight of her past was something she wasn't yet ready to share. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, "My life was stolen from me. I didn't choose this. None of us do." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time in a long while, Leo felt a crack in his hardened exterior. He was no stranger to the suffering of others. He had seen it, lived through it, and come to accept it as a natural consequence of his world. But Zara's words, her voice, pierced through that armor in a way that he didn't expect. She wasn't just a slave. She wasn't just another piece of cargo. She was someone with a history, with a story that Leo had no right to know, but now, for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to. As he walked away, the weight of the encounter lingered in his mind. He had dealt with many transactions like this before, bought and sold countless prisoners in the dark corners of the galaxy. But this was different. He wasn't just transporting her to another life of servitude. Something about Zara made him question the choices he had made in his own life, the decisions that had brought him to this point. He wasn't just dealing with an alien slave anymore. He was dealing with a person. Leo didn't know what to make of the feelings swirling inside him. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate himself from the emotional chaos of his work. But Zara had broken through that barrier. He found himself wondering, for the first time in years, if maybe he wasn't just a pawn in a game much larger than he could comprehend. Maybe there was something more to this than just survival. Maybe, just maybe, there was a purpose to their meeting. As the ship sped through the vast expanse of space, Leo couldn't shake the image of Zara from his mind. Her eyes, those violet eyes, lingered in his thoughts, her quiet strength echoing in his every move. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just another transaction. This was something that would change both of their lives forever. And in the silence of the ship's hull, Leo realized that the journey he was about to embark on wasn't just about delivering a slave. It was about discovering a truth buried deep within the galaxy, a truth that only Zara could reveal, and one that would forever alter the course of his life. Captain Leo Radic had always considered himself a man of pragmatism, cold, calculated, and ever focused on survival in the unforgiving expanse of space. The line between ally and enemy was clear, and as a mercenary, his role was simple: get the job done, no matter the cost. He had crossed paths with countless individuals throughout his career: slaves, criminals, political exiles, and in all his years, he had never once allowed himself to see beyond the roles they played in his mission. Until Zara. There was something about her, something different from every other captive he had ever transported. The alien woman, sold as payment for a debt, had been little more than a nameless commodity in the transaction, a piece of property to be delivered and forgotten. Yet, from the moment he laid eyes on her, something unsettled him. She was not just another victim of the galaxy's cruel system, she was an enigma. And it wasn't long before Leo found himself asking questions he had never asked before, questioning everything he had built his life upon. Zara had arrived aboard his ship, bound in chains, silent and subdued, her eyes dull from the weight of years spent under the thumb of those who saw her only as a tool. She didn't speak much in the beginning, but it wasn't the silence that intrigued Leo, it was the way she carried herself, the way she held her head high despite her circumstances. It was as if, beneath the chains and the scars, she was more than just a prisoner. Leo had seen hundreds of slaves in his time, but none like Zara. She had a quiet dignity that could not be crushed, a fire in her eyes that defied the very notion of ownership. At first, Leo had dismissed these thoughts. After all, what did it matter to him who she was or what she had endured? He was paid to transport her, and that was all. He was a man of business, not sentiment. But as days turned into weeks, the feeling in his gut grew stronger. Every glance at her, every fleeting moment when their eyes met across the room, seemed to stir something in him that he had long since buried. It was as though she was reaching out to him, not with words, but with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Zara never tried to escape. She never rebelled. Yet, her presence in the ship, in Leo's life, was a constant reminder that the world was more complex than the roles people played. She was not just a slave, she was a person. And that realization gnawed at Leo's conscience. It wasn't the slavery that bothered him, not at first, but the idea that he was complicit in her suffering, that he had become another cog in the machine that kept people like her in chains. His hardened, detached exterior began to crack, revealing a vulnerability he had long ago chosen to ignore. In the moments they shared in silence, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Zara was not like the other captives Leo had met. She was stronger than anyone had a right to be, given the horrors she had endured. And slowly, without either of them truly realizing it, a strange connection began to form between them. It wasn't the typical master-slave relationship. There was no sense of power in his ownership of her. No, this was something different, something that transcended the labels they had both been forced to wear. It was a bond that existed beyond chains and commands, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. One night, while the ship was cruising through the quiet expanse of space, Leo found himself in the common room. He had just finished his duties and was taking a moment to clear his mind. It was then that Zara entered, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the metal floors. She wasn't here for orders, and Leo knew it. She simply wanted to exist in the same space as him, as though their worlds had suddenly become intertwined in a way neither of them could explain. Their conversations, which had started as simple exchanges, slowly began to reveal more about one another. Leo found himself drawn to her, not just because of her beauty, though it was undeniable, but because of the depth she possessed. She had lived a life of unimaginable pain, but she spoke of it with a quiet strength that humbled him. She did not beg for sympathy, she didn't even ask for his help. She simply spoke of her past with a detachment that suggested she had already made peace with it, as if the trauma had become a part of her, something she had learned to live with. Zara, in turn, began to see Leo in a new light. He was not the cold-hearted mercenary she had assumed him to be. She saw the flicker of kindness in his eyes when he wasn't looking, the way he hesitated before making decisions that affected her life. She saw the guilt in his gaze whenever their eyes met, a silent apology for something he couldn't yet understand. It was these small moments, these cracks in his armor, that made her begin to believe in him, in his humanity. She didn't see him as her captor, not anymore. He was a man, struggling with his own burdens, his own choices that had led him to her. And in those moments, when they shared their silence, she could sense that he was trying to understand her, trying to see beyond the chains. The change in their relationship was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But it was undeniable. As they spent more time together, as they shared more words, more stories, a bond began to form between them, a bond not defined by power or subjugation, but by mutual respect and understanding. Leo was no longer the detached mercenary, and Zara was no longer just a slave. They were two people, two souls who had crossed paths by chance, but whose connection ran far deeper than the roles the universe had forced upon them. One day, after a particularly long conversation about their respective pasts, Leo found himself looking at Zara in a way he had never looked at anyone before. It wasn't with pity or sympathy, but with something else, something he couldn't name. He had come to realize that she had taught him something about himself. She had taught him that the labels we wear, the roles we play, don't define who we are. She had shown him that beneath the surface, beneath the chains of expectation and duty, there is something more, something pure, something that could transcend the darkness of the galaxy. Their relationship, once defined by the strict boundaries of master and slave, had evolved into something else entirely. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its struggles, but in the end, it was real. They were not bound by the roles the universe had imposed upon them, they were bound by something far more powerful, a connection that had no name but was undeniable all the same. In that quiet, shared space, between the stars and the silence, Leo and Zara found something neither had expected. Not redemption, not salvation, but something that transcended all of it. A connection that defied the galaxy's rules, a bond forged not by ownership, but by understanding. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest corners of the universe, two people, regardless of their pasts, their pain, or their differences, could find each other and, in that moment, become something more than they had ever imagined. For Leo Radek, the revelation about Zara's true identity came at a time when he least expected it. By then, they had shared countless conversations, moments of tension, silence, and unexpected closeness. He had come to care for her in a way that defied the logic of his life as a mercenary, a life built on transactions, detachment, and cold pragmatism. But Zara had been different. She had slowly broken through the walls he had spent years building, until there was nothing left to protect him from the truth of his growing affection for her. Yet, even in the midst of their deepening bond, Leo had no idea just how much of an illusion his understanding of her had been. It wasn't until one fateful night, while they were docked at a remote station for a routine supply run, that the truth about Zara was laid bare. Leo had stepped away from his ship, leaving Zara in the care of a few trusted crew members, and had made his way into the bustling, neon-lit streets of the station. He had no particular reason to leave, no great need for any personal time. But something had been gnawing at him. The weight of his growing feelings for Zara felt heavy, and he needed to clear his mind. As he walked through the crowded streets, he noticed something strange, something out of place. A group of men, dressed in finely tailored robes that spoke of wealth and power, were moving swiftly through the crowd. Their stern faces, their calculating eyes, and the way they seemed to part the crowd effortlessly made it clear they were not ordinary people. And, among them, there was one face that struck Leo like a bolt of lightning. It was Zara. But it wasn't the Zara he knew. This woman exuded power, elegance, and grace in a way he had never seen before. Gone was the quiet, submissive slave he had come to know. In her place stood a woman with an air of command, a presence that demanded respect. Leo's heart began to race as he tried to understand what he was seeing. He stepped forward, hesitating for a moment, then called out, his voice trembling with confusion. "Zara." The woman turned, her eyes narrowing slightly as they met his. For a split second, there was a flicker of recognition. But it wasn't the warmth, the soft familiarity he had come to expect. It was something cold, distant. She didn't speak immediately, instead studying him with an almost calculating gaze. It was then that Leo saw it. Behind her regal demeanor, behind the poised expression, something flickered in her eyes. It was fear. But it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of something else, something far more powerful than him. As the men around her shifted, one of them stepped forward, his voice carrying authority. "You're in the presence of Princess Zara of the Ascendant Kingdom. Show respect." The words hit Leo like a slap across the face. Princess. Zara, his Zara, the woman he had shared stories with, the woman who had opened her heart to him in the quiet, shared moments between the stars was a princess. The same woman who had been delivered to him in chains, who had been treated as nothing more than property, was a figure of royalty, a person of immense power. The realization struck him hard, his mind scrambling to process the enormity of the truth. Zara's eyes softened for just a moment before she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I never wanted you to know," she said, her voice low but filled with an emotion Leo couldn't quite place. There was regret, perhaps, but also a hint of sadness. It was a sadness that seemed to come from a deeper well, a sorrow rooted in the very core of who she was. "Why didn't you tell me?" Leo demanded, his voice rising, the hurt in his words evident. "Why didn't you tell me the truth? All this time, I've been treating you like a slave, like property, and you dash." "I never wanted your pity, Leo," she interrupted, her voice sharp now, though there was still that lingering sadness beneath it. "I never wanted you to look at me differently, to see me as a princess first and a person second. I was hoping that you would see me for who I really am, and not for the title I carry." Leo was silent for a long moment, processing what she had said. The pain in his chest deepened, the guilt gnawing at him. He had thought he knew Zara. He had believed they had forged something real, something built on shared pain and understanding. But now, standing before him, was a woman he couldn't recognize, a woman whose identity was a lie he had been living for months. "I don't understand," Leo finally said, his voice hoarse. "You were a slave. Why? How could you be in that position if you were a princess?" Zara's face hardened, the softness in her eyes replaced by a steely resolve. "I was taken. Kidnapped. A political move by my enemies. The Ascendant Kingdom is not the peaceful empire it once was. We are at war, and my family, my kingdom has been crumbling. I was sold to the highest bidder, my life reduced to a pawn in a game I never wanted to play." The weight of her words hit Leo like a wave, and in that moment, he understood. Zara's life had been one of unimaginable sacrifice. Her position, her royal blood, had not protected her from the cruelty of the universe. If anything, it had made her a target, a weapon to be used and discarded. And when she had been sold to Leo as a slave, it hadn't been the end of her story, it had been a new chapter, one she had been forced to endure for reasons she had never been able to explain. "I didn't want you to see me as a princess," Zara continued, her voice softer now, tinged with vulnerability. "I didn't want you to see me as someone above you. I wanted to be seen as just Zara, the woman who had been broken, but who found a little bit of hope in the midst of it all. I didn't want you to treat me like a commodity, a symbol. I wanted you to see the real me, the person who shared her fears and dreams with you." Leo stood there, stunned. He had been living a lie, but so had she. And now, as the pieces of her past began to fall into place, he realized that everything he thought he knew about her had been a facade, one she had built to protect herself from the very people who had taken everything from her. She hadn't just been hiding her true identity, she had been hiding from the world that had made her who she was. The silence between them was deafening. Leo didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to reconcile the woman he had come to love with the truth of her identity. But one thing became clear, he had to make a choice. Would he see her as a princess, as a person of power and wealth, or would he see her as the woman who had become his equal, the woman who had stolen his heart despite everything? Zara looked at him, her eyes full of fear, but also hope, a hope that, despite everything, he would understand. And for the first time in their time together, Leo realized that what she had needed from him wasn't pity. It wasn't his admiration for her title. It was his understanding, his acceptance of her as a person, as someone who had suffered, who had survived, and who deserved to be seen for who she truly was. "Zara," Leo said finally, his voice raw but resolute. "I don't know what this means, or what comes next. But I know one thing for sure, I don't care what you are. I care about who you are." And in that moment, the barriers that had separated them, titles, expectations, and the cruel hand of fate, began to fade away, replaced by something deeper, something that had always been there but had taken time to reveal itself. The truth had come at a price, but it had also set them free. The weeks that followed the revelation of Zara's true identity were a whirlwind of emotions, uncertainties, and the kind of profound connection that neither Leo nor Zara could have foreseen. Despite the layers of complexity surrounding them, her royal status, his mercenary past, the vast chasm between their worlds, they found themselves bound not by power or titles, but by something far more intimate and far more fragile: trust. At first, Leo had been overwhelmed. The truth about Zara's royal lineage had turned his entire understanding of her upside down. The woman he had come to know as a slave, someone broken by the system and sold to the highest bidder, was actually a princess of a powerful kingdom, entangled in the political struggles of her people. She was not just any woman, she was someone whose very existence could shift the course of galactic history. Yet, despite all that, she had chosen to stay with him, to endure the life she had in the mercenary ship, not as a princess, but as Zara, the woman he had come to care for. But beyond the shock of the revelation, there was a deeper, more pressing question that gnawed at Leo. How could they possibly build something real, something enduring, when their lives had always been defined by opposite ends of the spectrum? He was a man who had spent years in the shadow of violence, war, and betrayal. She was a woman born into the bright but treacherous corridors of royal power, a pawn in a game that she had never wanted to play. Their lives had never been their own, and yet here they were, thrown together in a delicate dance between power and vulnerability. What happened next could have easily fallen into the realm of disaster. With all the expectations that came with Zara's status and the intricacies of political maneuvering in her world, it would have been so easy for Leo to pull away. It would have been safer, after all, to keep his distance, to acknowledge the gulf between them and avoid the entanglement of emotions that had begun to brew between them. But what he hadn't anticipated, what neither of them could have anticipated, was the way that Zara began to soften the hardness that had long defined him. She was not just a princess, not just a figurehead to be admired from afar. She was someone who, despite everything, chose to be vulnerable with him. Their moments together became more than just shared silences or casual conversations. Slowly, their relationship deepened beyond the surface level of a mercenary and his slave, or even a princess and a commoner. It wasn't about what they could offer each other in terms of wealth or power, it was about what they shared in their souls. In those quiet moments when the world seemed to fade away, when there were no royal duties, no military tactics, no galaxy-spanning conflicts, they found solace in one another. Leo had always been someone who kept his emotions locked away, who had learned long ago that showing vulnerability was a luxury one couldn't afford in his line of work. But with Zara, he began to feel the chains of his own emotional prison loosening, piece by piece. For Zara, the shift was even more profound. She had spent so many years as a pawn in the games of her enemies, her life dictated by the whims of others. Her role as a princess had always been a matter of survival, of playing a part to protect herself and her kingdom. But in Leo, she had found something unexpected, someone who saw her as more than her title, more than her lineage. He saw her as a woman, not a princess. He saw her not as a tool to be used for power, but as a person with her own fears, desires, and dreams. That kind of acceptance was something she had never truly known. In his eyes, she was not a royal to be revered from afar, nor a political asset to be bartered for. She was simply Zara, a woman with a past that had shaped her, but not defined her. As their bond grew, it wasn't just in the small moments of tenderness that became increasingly frequent between them. It was in the way they began to challenge each other, to open up to the complexities of their own lives. They didn't shy away from the difficult conversations, the awkward silences, or the uncomfortable truths. Leo would ask about the politics of her kingdom, and Zara would share her fears about the future of her people. In turn, she would ask about his life as a mercenary, and Leo would reveal the pieces of his past he had long kept buried, not wanting anyone to see the man he had once been. Their vulnerabilities intertwined in such a way that neither could have predicted. What had begun as a relationship defined by their stark differences, his roughness and her grace, had transformed into something infinitely more valuable, mutual respect and an understanding that transcended the world that had separated them. For Zara, one of the most profound moments in their growing relationship came when she realized that Leo no longer viewed her as a symbol of her kingdom, as a princess to be admired or used. He had stopped treating her as a distant figure of royalty, and instead, he began to see her for who she was, a person who had been forced into circumstances beyond her control but had fought fiercely to remain true to herself. His respect for her was not conditional on her title. It was because of her strength, her resilience, and the person she had become. Leo, too, began to see Zara in a way he never had before. In the past, he had been hesitant to allow anyone to get too close, especially someone like her, someone with power, wealth, and a life so different from his own. But as their bond grew, he began to realize that it was not just her past or her title that defined her. It was her ability to find strength in the face of adversity, her unwavering determination to protect the people she loved, and her unwavering faith in their connection. And with each passing day, Leo's admiration for her grew into something more, something that neither of them could have predicted. In time, their relationship evolved beyond the boundaries of power, beyond the realm of politics and control. It became about their shared experiences, their shared humanity. The life of a mercenary and a princess, two seemingly opposing forces, began to merge into something new, something more powerful than either had ever imagined. It was no longer about what they could give each other in terms of wealth or status. It was about what they could give each other in terms of emotional honesty, trust, and the simple act of choosing to stand by each other despite the complexities of their lives. Through each challenge, each moment of uncertainty, Leo and Zara's relationship continued to grow, not in the shadow of power, but in the light of something more enduring, love, trust, and the belief that no matter what the future held, they were no longer two people separated by their differences. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word, bound not by power, but by the deep, unshakable bond they had forged in the face of adversity. In the vast, unyielding expanse of space, where the stars shine like distant promises and entire civilizations rise and fall with the sweep of history, Leo and Zara's struggle for survival began to take on a deeper meaning. It was no longer just about navigating the dangers of the galaxy or evading the relentless enemies that sought their destruction. It became a battle for something far greater, something more profound than either of them had initially realized, the right to define their future, the ability to reshape their destinies, and the unwavering belief that love and loyalty could transcend the cold, impersonal forces of power. The galaxy, once a symbol of infinite possibility, had turned into a battlefield. Leo had always known that his life as a mercenary would be fraught with danger and conflict, but he had never anticipated the personal stakes that would come to define this new chapter. His bond with Zara, a bond forged in secrecy and fraught with the tension of political intrigue, was now the focal point of a much larger struggle. They were no longer just fugitives on the run, trying to escape the clutches of those who sought to use them as pawns in a galactic game of power. They were becoming symbols of resistance, of defiance, and of the possibility that change could emerge even in the darkest corners of the universe. For Zara, the realization of the stakes had come in the form of an overwhelming sense of responsibility. As a princess, she had been trained to think in terms of the greater good, of the needs of her people, and the politics that ruled her kingdom. But now, standing beside Leo, she began to see the galaxy differently. The struggles she had once viewed as distant, as problems that belonged to the realm of politicians and diplomats, now felt immediate and deeply personal. The power of her birthright had been meant to protect her people, to preserve the peace of her kingdom, but it had also made her a target. Enemies lurked at every corner, waiting to exploit any weakness, and her role as a princess no longer seemed like a position of safety. It was a position of constant vulnerability. Yet, despite the danger that loomed over them, it was in the darkest moments that Leo and Zara found their true strength. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their right to exist on their own terms. They were fighting for the chance to love without the constraints of politics, for the opportunity to build a future together despite the forces that sought to tear them apart. And in that fight, they discovered a strength they had never known before. Leo had always believed that survival was the only thing that mattered. He had been a soldier, a mercenary, for so long that the idea of something greater than survival had seemed almost laughable. The galaxy, after all, was a brutal place. People died for power, for money, for revenge. Loyalty was a luxury, and love was an illusion. But with Zara, his perspective began to change. He saw, for the first time, that survival wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to merely exist in a universe filled with endless conflict. They had to fight for something more than just their lives. They had to fight for their dignity, for the freedom to choose their path, and for the future they both longed to build. Together, Leo and Zara faced not only the external threats that pursued them but also the internal struggles that threatened to tear them apart. Their relationship, once forged in secrecy, was now a weapon that could be used against them. The galaxy was full of enemies, political factions, mercenary groups, and even former allies who saw their bond as a threat. Zara's royal bloodline made her a target for those who sought to control her, to use her as a pawn in their own schemes. Leo, once a soldier who had fought for money and survival, now found himself fighting for something much greater. He was no longer just a hired gun, he was a protector, a man willing to sacrifice everything for the woman he loved and the future they dreamed of. But it wasn't just the physical battles they faced. The emotional and psychological toll of their struggle began to weigh heavily on both of them. For Zara, the pressure of her responsibilities as a princess and the constant danger that surrounded her created a tension she had never known. She had always been told what to do, always expected to put her people's needs above her own. But now, for the first time in her life, she had someone who wanted her to choose her own path, to fight for her own happiness. The weight of that choice was both liberating and terrifying. Could she abandon everything she had been taught to believe in, everything that had been expected of her, in order to build a new life with Leo? The answer was not as simple as it seemed. For Leo, the journey was no less complicated. His past had always been defined by violence, betrayal, and loss. He had trusted no one, relied on no one. But now, as he fought beside Zara, as he risked everything to protect her and their future, he began to understand the true meaning of loyalty. He had spent his life running from attachments, from emotions, from the pain of loss. But with Zara, he realized that love wasn't a weakness, it was his greatest strength. It was the force that drove him to fight, not just for survival, but for the right to define his own destiny. For the first time, he understood that fighting for something greater than himself was the only way to truly win. The battles they fought were not just physical skirmishes against mercenaries and political factions. They were battles for their very souls, for the belief that they could shape their own future in a galaxy that seemed determined to break them. In every battle they fought, in every enemy they faced, they discovered more about themselves and each other. They learned that survival was just the beginning, and that the real fight was for something that transcended the violence and the chaos of the galaxy. It was a fight for love, for freedom, and for the courage to stand together in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the struggles they faced only strengthened their resolve. They had been forged in the fire of adversity, and they emerged from each battle not just as survivors, but as warriors who had fought for more than their lives, for something far more precious, the right to love, to choose, and to fight for the future they had dreamed of. And in that fight, they discovered the true meaning of victory, not in the defeat of their enemies, but in the triumph of their shared journey, the resilience of their bond, and the hope that no matter how dark the galaxy might become, they would always fight, together, for more than just survival. In the vast and unforgiving stretches of space, where the light of distant stars flickers like fading hopes, the journey of Leo and Zara took an unexpected and transformative turn. The galaxy, with its unyielding forces of power and politics, seemed to conspire against them at every turn, pushing them to the very limits of endurance. But in this crucible of adversity, something incredible began to happen not only in the galaxy but within themselves. The notion of strength, once a rigid concept defined by survival and conquest, began to shift, to evolve, and to take on a more profound meaning. It became less about the battles they fought and more about the sacrifices they made and the way those sacrifices transformed them, both as individuals and as a couple. At the heart of their transformation was the realization that true strength was not in the ability to dominate or destroy but in the capacity to endure, to give of oneself, and to rise from the ashes of loss and hardship. Leo had always prided himself on his physical prowess, his ability to fight, to defend, and to survive. As a mercenary, he had lived by the belief that strength was a matter of control over his environment, over his emotions, over his fate. He had built walls around himself, protecting his heart from the pain of loss, from the vulnerability that came with love, and from the dangerous world of loyalty and sacrifice. But as he watched Zara, his princess, his partner, face the immense weight of her responsibilities, he began to understand that strength was far more than just the ability to wield a weapon or survive another battle. Zara, too, had been raised to think of strength in terms of authority, power, and the security of her royal bloodline. As a princess, she had always been expected to bear the weight of her people's expectations and the rigid structures of her kingdom. She had been trained to lead with conviction, to be unyielding, and to make decisions that would preserve the future of her people even at the cost of her own happiness. But as she stood beside Leo, facing the shared trials and challenges of their journey, her view of strength began to change. She began to see that true leadership, true power, was not just about making others follow, about commanding respect. It was about vulnerability, about understanding that the greatest strength was the ability to sacrifice for those you loved, for the greater good, and for the future you dreamed of. The sacrifices they made were not simply for survival, but for each other and the future they sought to build together. Zara had already given up so much to be with Leo: the comforts of her royal life, the security of her title, the expectations of her people. Every day, she risked her life, her safety, and her heart for the chance to carve out a new destiny. But the cost of that sacrifice was steep. She often found herself torn between the responsibilities she could no longer escape and the love she shared with Leo. It was not easy for her to let go of the identity she had known, the role she had been born into, the future she had been expected to fulfill. Yet, in the quiet moments between the chaos, when she looked into Leo's eyes, she knew that the strength to endure this was within her. She had the courage to let go, to surrender her old life, and to embrace the unknown. For Leo, the sacrifices were just as profound. His life had always been one of independence, a life built on self-sufficiency and detachment. He had kept his heart locked away, believing that attachment was a weakness and that love was something best avoided. But in falling for Zara, in becoming bound to her in a way that transcended the physical and emotional realms, he discovered a new kind of strength. It was a strength that came from vulnerability, from the willingness to put someone else's well-being above his own. It was a strength that came from selflessness, from the desire to protect not just himself, but the woman he loved, and to protect the future they were building together. In the moments of greatest peril, when the threats around them grew insurmountable, when every choice seemed fraught with danger, Leo and Zara found that their sacrifices were not burdens to bear but opportunities for transformation. Every challenge, every trial, became a crucible in which they were both forged anew. They had to let go of the illusions of control, of the belief that they could fight their way out of every situation. They learned to trust each other, to lean on one another when the weight of their circumstances threatened to crush them. One of the most defining sacrifices came when Zara faced the choice between returning to her kingdom and taking her place as a ruler, or staying with Leo and continuing their fight together. The pressure from her people, from her family, was immense. They needed her, but she needed Leo, and together, they needed to fight for a future where they could both exist on their own terms. The decision tore at her, as it was a betrayal not just of her royal duties but of the identity she had built her entire life around. But in choosing Leo, she was choosing to redefine herself, to let go of the title and the expectations that had long defined her, and to embrace a future where her strength came from her love for him and her willingness to fight for a life beyond the palace walls. Leo, too, made sacrifices. He had lived his life for so long without a real connection to anyone, without a reason to care beyond the next paycheck. His heart had been hardened by years of betrayal and loss, and he had learned to keep his emotions buried deep. But with Zara, he discovered that love was not a burden, it was the source of his greatest strength. And so, when the galaxy seemed determined to tear them apart, when the enemies they faced were too numerous and too powerful to overcome, Leo's sacrifice was not just one of action but of heart. He had to let go of the man he had been and embrace the vulnerability of trusting Zara completely, of placing his future in her hands as much as she placed hers in his. In the end, it was through their sacrifices, both big and small, that Leo and Zara transcended their individual limitations and discovered a new kind of power. They learned that true strength wasn't about fighting to the bitter end, but about choosing to fight for something more, something that could not be measured in terms of victories or defeats. They learned that love, sacrifice, and transformation were the real sources of power, and that it was in these moments of vulnerability, of letting go, that they truly found their strength. The universe, with all its dangers and uncertainties, might have tried to break them, but in the end, it was their willingness to sacrifice for each other that turned them into something greater than they ever could have been on their own. As the final echoes of battle faded and the dust of war began to settle, the galaxy stood at a precipice, teetering between the darkness of its past and the promise of a new dawn. Leo and Zara, two souls bound not just by love but by a shared destiny, had fought not only for survival but for a future they could believe in. They had faced unimaginable odds, with enemies too powerful and forces too vast to comprehend. Yet in the end, it was their unity, their willingness to sacrifice, and their unwavering belief in a better tomorrow that had carried them through the darkest moments of their journey. Victory, in its purest form, is not always about the triumph over an enemy, the destruction of a rival power, or the capture of an elusive prize. Sometimes, victory is found in the quiet moments, in the reflections that follow the storms of conflict. For Leo and Zara, victory was not just in defeating those who sought to tear them apart, it was in the freedom they had earned, the peace they had forged from the crucible of war, and the knowledge that they had secured a future not just for themselves but for the galaxy as a whole. Their struggle had become the catalyst for change, the spark that would ignite a transformation in a galaxy long marred by strife, oppression, and division. The road to this victory had been anything but easy. From the very beginning, their path had been fraught with challenges. Zara, once a princess caught in the rigid expectations of her royal lineage, had given up everything to stand beside Leo. She had left behind the comfort of her title, the safety of her palace, and the future she had once envisioned for herself. She had chosen the uncertain path of love, of rebellion, and of a destiny shaped by her own hands rather than those of the kingdom that had once claimed her as their own. Leo, the mercenary turned hero, had similarly shed the armor of his past. He had entered the fight with no intention other than survival, with no dream greater than the next job, the next contract. But in Zara, he had found something worth more than wealth, more than power, a reason to believe in something beyond himself, something worth fighting for. Together, they had stood against forces that sought to undo them, against the mercenaries who would stop at nothing to destroy their dreams, against the oppressive forces of Zara's own family who viewed her rebellion as nothing more than a betrayal. Their victory was not just a personal one, it was the victory of the countless voices in the galaxy who had long been silenced, of the oppressed who had been forced to live in the shadows of fear, and of those who had fought, often in vain, for a chance at a life of freedom and equality. As they stood on the precipice of this new world, they knew that their fight was not truly over. The galaxy, for all its scars and turmoil, was vast. And while their enemies had been defeated, many others still lurked in the unseen corners of space, waiting for their moment to rise again. But Leo and Zara no longer viewed the galaxy as an insurmountable force of chaos. They now saw it as a canvas, one that they could help shape, one that they could rebuild with the lessons they had learned and the love they had discovered in each other's arms. Victory, they realized, was not just about the end of conflict, it was about the journey that lay ahead. In this new beginning, they no longer faced the future with fear but with a renewed sense of purpose. Their love had been tested in ways they had never imagined. They had fought side by side, bled together, and sacrificed more than they had ever thought possible. And yet, in the face of every trial, every loss, and every impossible decision, they had emerged stronger, more unified, and more determined to see the galaxy transformed. Zara, once bound by the constraints of her royal bloodline, now stood as a symbol of a new kind of leadership. She was no longer just a princess, a mere figurehead in a game of power. She had become a beacon of hope, a leader who ruled not with an iron fist, but with compassion, understanding, and a vision for a galaxy where every being, regardless of race or status, could live freely and with dignity. Her people, once divided and lost in the ravages of war, looked to her not as a ruler from a distant throne, but as one of their own, someone who had fought beside them, bled beside them, and understood their struggles. Leo, on the other hand, had shed the identity of the lone mercenary, the hardened warrior who had long distrusted others and believed in the fleeting nature of loyalty. Through Zara, he had discovered a new purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to lead not with the sword, but with integrity and a willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. Together, they were a force that the galaxy had never seen before, a duo bound by love, strength, and a shared dream of a future that was free from the chains of oppression. But beyond the personal victory, beyond the triumph of love over adversity, there was the larger promise that they now embodied. The galaxy, once fractured into 1,000 competing factions, now stood on the brink of a new era. The old systems of power, of royal bloodlines and mercenary contracts, were no longer enough to sustain the future. It was time for new structures to emerge, ones built on cooperation, unity, and the shared goals of all sentient beings. And Leo and Zero were determined to lead the charge. They knew the path ahead would not be easy. The shadows of war were never fully gone, and there would always be those who sought to divide, to conquer, to impose their will on others. But the victory they had achieved was not just a defeat of their enemies, it was a call to arms for those who believed in a different future, one where strength was not measured in power or wealth, but in the ability to uplift others, to share in the struggle, and to fight for what was right. As the stars glistened overhead, as the silent hum of their ship echoed through the vast emptiness of space, Leo and Zara shared a quiet moment, a moment of peace that was as fleeting as it was precious. The galaxy had been changed, and with it, so had they. They were no longer the same people who had first met, the mercenary and the princess. They were now something new, something greater than the sum of their parts. And in the quiet spaces between them, they knew that their journey was far from over. It was just the beginning. With their victory, they had not only reshaped the course of the galaxy, they had created the possibility of a future where love, sacrifice, and unity could define the path forward. It was a future that was uncertain, but one they were ready to face, side by side, with hope in their hearts and the stars as their guide. The stars had always been a symbol of hope, a distant, sparkling promise of something greater beyond the realm of the known. For millennia, civilizations across the galaxy had gazed at them, dreaming of what lay beyond their reach. But for Leo and Zara, the stars were no longer simply distant lights in the sky. They had become a reflection of the legacy they were about to leave behind. A legacy not just for themselves, but for the galaxy as a whole. A legacy of hope, unity, and transformation, forged in the fires of battle and the bonds of love. It had been a long journey, one that neither of them had ever truly expected. The mercenary who had lived for the next contract, the royal princess whose life was dictated by the expectations of her family and people, each had come from worlds that could not have been further apart. Yet, in the crucible of war and rebellion, their paths had crossed, and in their connection, they had found not only a new purpose but a new understanding of what it meant to be truly free. Their love, their shared sacrifice, and their unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future had become the foundation upon which a new galaxy could be built. But as they stood on the precipice of this new era, they knew that their fight was far from over. The victory they had secured over mercenaries, royal forces, and centuries of oppression was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the galaxy, a chapter that they now had the power to write. It wasn't just about them anymore. The battle they had fought had never been only for their own survival. It had been for the countless lives that had been crushed beneath the weight of tyranny, for the oppressed who had long been silenced, and for the dreamers who had dared to believe that peace was possible. They had given their all, sacrificed everything, and in return, they had created the conditions for a new kind of galaxy, one built on hope, not fear, one built on the shared struggle of all its inhabitants, not the greed of a few. The first steps of this new beginning were the hardest. It was not enough to simply defeat the old powers that had ruled the galaxy with an iron grip. What followed was the rebuilding, the creation of a new system, one that would ensure that no one group, no one species, would ever hold dominion over the rest again. It was a task that would take time, patience, and careful diplomacy, but Leo and Zara were no longer daunted by the enormity of the challenge. They knew that they had already achieved the impossible by surviving their journey and by finding a way to unite against overwhelming odds. As they traveled through the galaxy, from one planet to the next, meeting with leaders of various species and factions, it became clear that their message had taken root. What began as a small rebellion, a handful of determined individuals, had spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Every planet they visited, every settlement they entered, was filled with people who had once thought that freedom was out of reach, now emboldened by the realization that it was not only possible but within their grasp. The galaxy, once fractured and broken, was beginning to heal. But healing, as they soon learned, was never a straightforward process. The old wounds of the past centuries of distrust, betrayal, and war could not be erased overnight. Some planets, some people, were still entrenched in the ways of the old world, resistant to change, afraid of what might come next. And it was in these moments, in the quiet battles for understanding and cooperation, that Leo and Zara's true legacy began to take shape. Their love, their unwavering bond, was no longer just a personal story. It had become the symbol of a new kind of strength, the kind of strength that was built on empathy, understanding, and a shared vision of the future. Their unity, the way they had bridged the gap between two worlds, had become a beacon for others to follow. It was a testament to the power of what could be achieved when individuals, no matter their origin, came together in pursuit of something greater than themselves. But their legacy was not just about uniting the galaxy. It was about redefining what strength truly meant. In the old world, strength was measured by power, by the ability to dominate and control. But Leo and Zara had shown the galaxy that true strength came from within, from the ability to love, to sacrifice, and to fight not for personal gain but for the greater good. They had rewritten the narrative of what it meant to be strong, and in doing so, they had changed the very fabric of the galaxy's future. The final test of their legacy came not in the form of battle or political strife, but in the way the next generation would remember them. As the galaxy began to rebuild, it became clear that the true measure of their success would not lie in the monuments that would be erected in their honor or the stories that would be told about their victories. It would lie in the way future generations carried their message forward, the way they would fight for peace, for equality, and for a galaxy where the stars were not a distant dream, but a reflection of the hope that burned within each of them. Leo and Zara had given the galaxy more than just a new beginning. They had given it a new way of seeing the universe, a way of seeing each other, not as conquerors and conquered, but as equals, as allies in the struggle for a better future. Their legacy was not just a victory over their enemies, but a victory over the old ways of thinking, the old systems that had perpetuated suffering and division. And in that victory, they had rewritten the stars themselves. As the years passed, Leo and Zara continued to lead, not from thrones or lofty palaces, but from the hearts of the people. They were no longer the mercenary and the princess, but something much greater, the embodiment of a new age. Together, they had created a future where the legacy of their love, their struggle, and their unwavering belief in a better galaxy would never fade. The stars that had once been distant and cold now shone brighter than ever, a testament to the legacy of two souls who had dared to rewrite the story of the galaxy. Their legacy was not just in the peace they had secured, but in the love that had blossomed in the face of adversity. And in the hearts of those they had fought for, the stars would always shine as a reminder that, in the end, it was love, unity, and sacrifice that had rewritten the future of the galaxy. Leo and Zara's journey is one of transformation, sacrifice, and the redefining of strength. Their story began with an unexpected twist of fate, where a mercenary found himself with an alien princess as a slave, only to later uncover that she was far more than what she appeared. As they navigated through political intrigue, personal challenges, and intergalactic battles, their bond deepened into a love that transcended power, hierarchy, and the norms of their respective worlds. Together, they broke down barriers, fought for justice, and rebuilt a galaxy that had been shattered by war and oppression. Through each trial, they discovered that true strength lies not in domination, but in unity, sacrifice, and love. Their legacy became a beacon of hope for a galaxy that had long been divided, showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change is possible when people come together with empathy and a shared vision. The lesson from Leo and Zara's story is profound. True strength is not measured by power or control, but by the ability to love, to sacrifice, and to work towards a collective good. It reminds us that overcoming differences and embracing unity is the foundation of meaningful change. In our own lives, we can apply this lesson by fostering empathy in our relationships, standing up for what is right, and working together to create a better future, no matter the obstacles. Just as Leo and Zara's love changed the galaxy, we too can reshape our world with the power of compassion and mutual understanding.